Welcome to the Slingshot. To help you digest your Thanksgiving meal, we've invited John Farrell to this episode. John is the director of the Energy Democracy Initiative at the Institute for Local Self-Reliance, or ILSR. He is a distributed energy expert whose work on energy self-reliant states was highlighted in the New York Times. John recently authored an ILSR report titled Upcharge: Hidden Costs of Electric Utility Monopoly Power, which spells out just how much the monopoly utility model is costing us. John has been with ILSR for 18 years, an amazing run. And prior to that, John was a researcher at the Humphrey Institute and the Urban Institute. And his LinkedIn CV proudly boasts his time as a, quote, customer service lackey at Best Buy in between those gigs. I guess that was the official title there. John holds a master's in public policy from the Humphrey School of Public Affairs at the University of Minnesota. Welcome, John, to the show.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, I also want to welcome my co-host, Darren Bush, who knows a thing or two about energy from his time in the Transportation, Energy, and Agricultural section at the Antitrust Division in the DOJ. Hello, Darren.
Good morning.
And today we will be discussing two topics: John's new study, of course, and number two, the lessons from the 2024 election, right? Because we're all election experts. So let's start off with John's new study first. John, I was hoping you could first just describe some of the social harms from granting private utilities a monopoly over electricity delivery. Perhaps you can help our listeners better understand the nature of these harms with some concrete examples.
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Even though it's sort of a depressing read, honestly, as a lead off to this conversation. I mean, I list at the beginning of the report about 4 or 5 major topics that in terms of utility harms. The first, and I think probably most important, is just that utilities are slowing our climate progress because of their ability to exercise their political power. For example, places like California, where they convinced regulators there that rooftop solar was presenting a threat to customers. Based on faulty data, they've managed to make sure that that market, which is in competition with them, was reduced when the regulators were willing to reduce compensation for rooftop solar customers. So the state is now making less progress toward its climate goals. Customers who wanted to install solar are making less money, and the grid is, retaining more polluting resources. The second problem is that utilities are inflating energy costs, and this really is directly a monopoly problem where utilities, they get their rate of return set by state regulators. And these state regulators have routinely awarded them rates of return far in excess of what would be necessary for them to effectively recover their costs and to bring in capital from the market. And so we've seen evidence that as much as customers are paying as much as $150 a year more than they ought to for energy services that could be delivered at a lower price. We have enormous health impacts of utility reliance on fossil fuels. Just as an example, when the coal power plants, which have been a backbone of our electricity system for many years, when a scrubber was put on a coal power plant near Louisville, Kentucky, it reduced respiratory-related hospitalizations by 400 per year in the adjacent county. So we know that we're killing ourselves, that we're harming our health. In fact, the health costs of fossil fuel combustion for electricity are estimated at $360 billion a year, which is almost equal to the total dollar amount of electricity sales in our country. So the externalities are enormous. And then finally, it's just utility disasters and corruption are eroding faith in the public oversight of the system. So you take Pacific Gas and Electric is, I think, a perfect example. A very large California utility provides gas and electricity service. The negligent pipeline maintenance led to a massive explosion. They killed customers, killed 8 people, and it resulted in criminal felony convictions. Then their negligent investment in maintenance for their electric system resulted in some massive wildfires, of course, sparked by climate change, with billions of dollars in damage and additional loss of life. And that utility still serves customers, still retains that monopoly to serve electric customers in Northern California, despite all of those massive mishandling of its work. So we've seen a lot of costs, financial, health, and to the climate of this business model. And unfortunately, we've seen our public leadership fail to hold utilities accountable.
Got it. Now I'm going to put on my jerky economist hat and be a jerk for this question. So apologies in advance. But a lot of economists would hear about these externalities, these negative externalities you described, and say, hey, maybe we should embrace the monopoly here because the higher prices are going to cut down on usage, and that might police the production of these negative externalities. What would you say to such a jerky economist if he were in the room with you today?
I love talking to jerky economists about how we price electricity, and obviously conservation is a big part of the conversation when we talk about trying to manage the energy system. The truth is, though, that we don't actually price electricity for customers in a way that's going to reduce their use. The high prices that we're paying right now are just padding shareholder profits. A perfect example is me. I live in Minnesota. My electricity costs the same exact amount 24/7, 15 cents a kilowatt hour. There's no incentive for me to reduce use during peak demand times, which is exactly the time that sort of drives the growth of the grid system. And even in places where they do have that kind of policy, like California, we're still seeing utilities get excessive profits. And so the problem is really around the way that we reward monopoly utilities for their investments in the system, particularly that they are focused almost entirely on capital investment that often isn't, in fact, the least cost way for them to provide those electricity services. So even if customers in California responding to very high electricity rates are reducing their usage, the utility incentive is still to go out and make capital investments in expanding the grid, even if that's not necessary, because that's how they make their return on investment. So the problem here is that we don't have enough jerky economists in the commission making sure that we are holding utilities accountable, and maybe too many looking at it only on the consumer side, where there's less opportunity really to drive behavior in a way that's going to make the system more affordable.
Well, let me put on my jerky economist hat, since we're going to be doing that. You're a big fan of distributed generation, and which for our listeners is the process of generating electricity close to where it'll be used, such as in the home or the business, in where the load is, where the demand is. Take an LA Times story recently, about speaking about California, in which so much solar energy was produced that California's solar farms had to curtail production of more than 3 million megawatt hours of solar energy, either on the orders of the state's grid operator or because prices had plummeted because of the glut. That's a quote from the LA Times. Um, and do you have any concerns about the potential for overcapacity, from such incentives?
I don't really. I mean, one of the things is just putting that number in context. 3 million megawatt hours sounds like a big number. It's got a million in front of it, and a megawatt seems like a lot. But, I mean, Minnesota's electricity market on an annual basis is over 60 million megawatt hours. So even if that was in Minnesota, it's a relatively small fraction of the total energy production. But the other thing is that we actually have a lot of tools to manage this. California is one of the leading states in deploying energy storage. So we have opportunities, and more uh, uh, independent companies and utilities are installing storage along with solar so that we can pack that energy away at noon and use it at a time when there's higher electricity demand. There's at least two other tools that we have at our disposal. One is asking people to install solar panels, incentivizing them to install solar panels facing a different direction. Almost all solar panels face directly south to maximize the total amount of kilowatt hour production. And the curtailment is happening like at noon on a sunny day when there's not a lot of electricity demand because all the solar panels are cranking out at 100%. But I have on my house, for example, west facing solar panels. So they don't produce as much at noon. In fact, they're not doing a whole lot until the afternoon, but then they're really cranking up in 6 p.m., 7 p.m. on a summer afternoon, aligning really well with when air conditioning demand is. So we can do more to incentivize people to do that kind of thing. We also have a lot more tools now available to us to encourage people to adjust their electricity usage to times when we have that glut of very low cost electricity production. So, we can connect our electric vehicle chargers to the internet. Or to utility systems. We can time when those things charge. We can offer people lower cost charging at noon in order that they can soak up that excess energy. And we've really only started to scratch the surface of what's possible for us to do in an era when we have way more advanced technology to ask customers to shift their demand to match when electricity supply is available. So I think that, the truth of it is that distributed energy is great because it can provide resilience. especially when people do energy storage, which is really important in these places like California, where you've got wildfires and utilities turning off power preemptively in order to avoid damage to the electricity system. We want people to make those investments. We just need to figure out how do we give them the right incentives to do it in a way that makes sure that we can capture as much of that affordable energy.
Right. Well, I'm in Texas, so I know a bit about California because I've written on Enron and a whole host of other electricity things. But let's stick with distributed generation. And one of the frustrating things as a Texas homeowner um, is that when the power goes out, and given that we have center point, that's frequently, um, if it's a stiff breeze or something like that, we can't use that. We can't use our solar when the power goes out, right? It disconnects from the grid. Absent backup batteries. If we have the backup batteries, then when the batteries are depleted, then we're out of luck. And at the same time, I can't help but notice the hurricane season's a little bit more brisk because of climate change. And so hardening of assets, transmission lines, distribution. And we had the great freeze back a while ago, where the power plants were not functioning, causing millions of dollars of damage. Um, so how do you incentivize hardening of those assets? And is distributed generation kind of in conflict with that? As you sort of take away incentives to the power to the utilities?
I don't think so at all. In fact, I think distributed generation really is kind of the key tool that we have available to us to have a more reliable system. I'll just give a few examples. One of them is that, there are limitations to our ability to harden ourselves against the impacts of climate change. Just look at Asheville, North Carolina. People thought that was a climate refuge. It was a place you could go to avoid, the impacts of juiced up hurricanes from climate change. And that the flooding there left people. I have a friend there who was without power for several weeks and even without running water, because of course they needed electricity in order to do that. So we need to recognize that we are not going to be able to build systems for the level of natural disasters that we're going to have to avoid any kind of damage, right? We certainly can do more. You have utilities in Florida that are doing concrete distribution poles instead of wooden ones, which make them much more resistant to high winds from hurricanes. And there are other investments that utilities can make. But you also have utilities, interestingly enough, take Green Mountain Power in Vermont. They've been investing in batteries on customer property, basically saying, like, we'll buy the battery and you can lease it from us. You can use it for backup power, but then we also get to use the battery on a day-to-day, hour-to-hour, minute-to-minute basis to manage the grid and to make it work more effectively. And that's one of the opportunities I think that's available here right now. Number one, with distributed energy, you're often getting customers to invest their own capital. So we bring more capital investment into bringing clean energy onto the grid system when we allow for and encourage distributed generation. And then the second thing is that these systems, by being close to where we use energy, allow us to manage the grid to be more efficient and more effective and more reliable 24/7, even in those times when we're not having natural disasters. For example, one of the ways that the system was designed sort of in the olden days when utilities were the only ones with the power plants is all the power came one way from a big power plant over transmission lines down to distribution lines, down to those poles and wires that go through our backyards. And the way that they dealt with the fact that voltage will drop over distance is that they basically turned it up too high at the beginning of the line. So if you're that first customer on the line, your voltage is pretty high, which can have impacts on electric appliances, et cetera. And then if you're at the very end of the line, your voltage is too low, and it's really only the person in the middle that's like the Goldilocks that hits that sweet spot. Well, with distributed generation, like rooftop solar and the inverter-based technology that goes with that, the inverters that convert it from DC electricity to AC, we can actually add voltage to the system at a lot of places along that line. We can actually reduce uh, that gap between the sort of the perfect voltage for all of our appliances and what the utility delivers, because they can use some of those resources that customers are developing. And I think just the last thing I would say is, like, we, instead of having kind of like one grid that we all have to rely on, we can create a lot of sort of resilient nodes on our grid with distributed generation that can be islands of light when the power goes out, or be sort of jump starters for the grid when it goes down.
Let me change subjects a little bit. John, you explain in your piece that utilities' exclusive control over the towers and wires of the electricity distribution grid allows them to block independent producers from connecting to the grid. It sounds to me like utilities are leveraging their power from a monopolized segment, here would be the towers and the wires, into segments such as power generation that could be competitively supplied. And so I ask, why can't antitrust laws be used to prevent such monopoly leveraging? Seems like you spelled out a nice complaint that could, a restraint that could be dropped into an antitrust complaint. And before you answer, don't tell me that there's another exemption to the antitrust laws.
Well, I'm sorry, Hal, that is exactly the problem.
Oh,
I am not a lawyer, but I am familiar enough at this point, having done this research, with something called the state action doctrine, which essentially says that these, by virtue of being overseen by public utility commissions, public service commissions, generally speaking, the things that utilities do are exempt from antitrust enforcement. That the presumption is that these state regulators are policing utility behavior and approving of utility behavior. Um, However, that in some ways is actually kind of untested, in the sense that one of the things, and this was in a Stanford Law Review piece by Michael Wara a few years ago, one of the arguments that he made was essentially that these state regulators, they are looking at whether or not what utilities are doing is prudent. That's one of sort of the terms of art. They are making sure that it is, that the benefits outweigh the costs, but they aren't often, and don't even have expertise in, competition policy. And so they're not considering, for example, when they look at, compensation for rooftop solar customers, whether or not it is having an anti-competitive effect. And so we actually haven't seen this tested very much. The challenge, unfortunately, is that in order to have standing, in order to pursue an antitrust case, you need to find a competitor that's willing to risk their livelihood on an antitrust lawsuit that, if they lose, will get them essentially blacklisted by the company that controls the grid. So if I'm a solar company and I rely on grid connections in order to get my solar sold into the market, I'm pretty reluctant to go out there and take a chance on suing the utility, because if I lose, that might be the end of my business, because the utility has all the power in that management of the grid system.
Well, let me ask, maybe Darren can weigh in here too, but could a state AG bring a case, an antitrust case, against one of these utilities, or the DOJ? Where I'm driving at, I hear what you're saying. A competitor would be afraid to do it, but is it a real hard and fast exemption, or is someone just suggesting that it's implicit because the utilities are being monitored by state agencies? Darren, you're on mute.
Yeah. Okay. This will probably make even less sense now that I'm unmuted. So, typically the question is whether or not the state there's a clear articulation of a policy to displace competition with regulation, and whether there's active supervision by the state is the typical mid-cal test. In this instance, we're talking about interconnection, which requires a whole host of questions about transmission reliability and all these other things that are really barriers to entry for the competitor to have to undertake. So interconnecting is not necessarily something that you can bring an antitrust challenge for. There are a couple of statutes that sort of were supposed to spur this, which was the Public Utility Regulatory Policies Act of 1978, which brought certain generation facilities to bear, and then the Energy Policy Act of 92, which was supposed to bring a whole bunch of other exempt wholesale generators to come in to compete. But in terms of antitrust law, this is one of those tricky areas. I mean, that antitrust does apply to, there's concurrent jurisdiction with respect to electric utility mergers, but between FERC and the DOJ. But bringing a refusal to deal case, particularly after Trinco, it's not just the state action doctrine; it's the Trinco problem too. So I have a question that's very wonky. So when we're talking about these natural monopolies, in terms of transmission and distribution infrastructure. So we've dealt with that in a lot of states by creating, the names change over time, independent system operators or RTOs, and to sort of to disaggregate the notion of ownership from control, there's pass through of the greatest amount of electricity possible. So what's the difference between what you're advocating and between this good old fashioned, FERC RTO, in order 2000 types of operators?
I love the wonky questions, so we'll dive right in here. I want to just note that most of my ideas around this come from two people: Lorenzo Christoph, who formerly worked at the California ISO, and Ari Pesco, who's done a lot of work on FERC and transmission planning. I just want to note for the record that the concept behind regional transmission organizations or independent system operators is what we want here at the distribution level as well. That we want to separate ownership of the system from operation of the system to remove those conflicts of interest that we have right now, where you take any problem on the distribution system and the utility will find a capital expense reason to solve it. It'll be like, well, we have a capacity problem. Are we going to go out and bid for distributed generation to solve it at a quarter of the cost? No, we're going to build a substation upgrade because we're going to get our regulated rate of return on that. And I think that was the vision behind the transmission planning that would have and the transmission development that would happen under the the regional independent system operator model. What Ari Pesco from the Harvard Electricity Law Initiative has found, though, is that unfortunately utilities still hold too much power over that. It is a nonprofit, independent in name organization, but a lot of the members of the board are former utility executives or very connected to those utilities that still own the assets. And that they've found ways to game the system in such that even though the directive from FERC is we want you to plan for a regional system that serves regional needs most cost effectively, utilities still stampede towards solutions that involve them investing their own capital and earning their regulated rate of return to build those transmission lines themselves. So yes, I do like the idea of taking the independent system operator model and bringing it down to the distribution system. But I think we have to be very clear-headed that there's been plenty of work showing that that model is not working out the way that we need it to. We're not getting the most affordable transmission development. We're getting far less than we would need to decarbonize the electricity system, to reduce congestion in ways that would reduce prices for consumers. So we have a conceptual model, I think, that is strong around this idea of separating asset ownership, but the execution of it has been unfortunately pretty lacking. So I do think there are a number of ways that we can approach that, but we do need to experiment with how can we get that planning aspect out of the hands of utilities. How can we incentivize utilities to approach things differently? There is at least one really good example. It was called the Brooklyn Queens Demand Management Project in New York, where the state regulation has shifted toward trying to find non-capital investment ways of solving problems. And there they were facing down, I think, $1 billion substation upgrade, and for about a quarter of the cost, found distributed, energy efficiency, conservation, solar and energy storage investments that were able to provide the same benefit and to defer that very substantial capital expense. So the goal is that we want to move in that direction. And I think the ideal would be you could have an operator of the system that would be looking out for solutions like that on behalf of consumers without its own financial interest.
I have a really quick story for you. After Enron in California, I interviewed with the California ISO, and I was asked, "What do you think happened here?" And I said, "You all were bad parents. Your regulation was awful, and it created terrible incentives to game the system, and you didn't fix those games." And I didn't get the job, and I'm still puzzled by that. Yeah, blaming the ISO, but
Now, John, you point out, just shifting gears, that utilities had hiked electricity prices to record levels in many regions, and that investor-owned utilities are able to get away with these hikes due to, quote, political connivance on the part of utilities, including bribery, end quote. Pretty strong words. I noticed something similar going on with respect to the insurance price hikes that were feeding inflation in part. You remember when the gurus were trying to identify the sectors, which ones are contributing most to overall inflation? Insurance rates kept spiraling at a faster rate of general inflation. And I dug into it and I saw they were negotiated, those rate hikes were negotiated between the insurers jointly with regulators, which just sounds like it could lead to all sorts of horrible things, including collusion. Seems like we have also a revolving door problem in the energy area as well, after reading your work. And I'm wondering, have you ever thought about ways to prevent energy regulators from being captured by utilities?
I mean, I think my dream is that we introduce competition in and we separate asset ownership in a way that makes it less lucrative for utilities to try to capture regulators. Part of the problem right now is that with the vertical integration of utility companies in 2/3 of the states, there's too much at stake for them not to want to invest in capturing their regulators. So, of course, it makes a very good investment for them to do electioneering investments, to make contributions to candidates, et cetera, because their profitability is almost entirely determined by the people that they're successful at putting in those positions. I think that if we had an independent distribution system operator, if we had utilities having to compete to do asset investments or capital investments with independent businesses, it doesn't mean that they lack an interest in the regulatory environment, which of course continues to be, high touch in in blue states around climate change and red states around energy costs and affordability and reliability. But I think it would help uh, to reduce the incentive to spend so much time investing in lobbyists, and rather than investing in the business. Um, but that being said, I think there are there are there's some new organizations actually looking at this, called one called Powerline that was just founded, looking at ways to bring in more advocacy from the nonprofit community, which has done a lot of work on energy and climate policy, trying to pay more attention to how they can strengthen how public utilities commissions can act, including paying more attention to the nomination process in the states where governors appoint them, or the election process, um, in order to make sure that people are paying more attention to those issues. So I think that's really important. I think you could have rules about what kind of people you want on the commission. But I think this is really a big challenge. I mean, honestly, I think one of the biggest reasons that we have the outcomes that we do that are suboptimal is that you have this asymmetry of information between utilities and regulators. Utilities know so much more about the system. Regulators are often deferring, especially on technical issues. And the only way to get people who have technical expertise a lot of times is to get them out of the utility. And so, I mean, we've seen that in Minnesota, for example. We had a very good run for about 6 years where we had an actual electrical engineer on the commission. And so he couldn't be bullshitted in the same way that other commissioners can everywhere across the country. And utilities are like, well, we can't do that. It's a reliability problem. And he'd be like, actually, I know everything about this because this is what my job was. So I think I do think about technical expertise as being one of those things that that commissions need more of in order to be able to contest with utilities and not rely on utilities to give them those answers. But I think it's a real problem. And I think even with structural change, you're still going to have incentives for anybody who's in a regulated business to try to have influence with their regulators.
Well, let's see if we can apply this in the opposite direction. You advocate for community broadband networks, and you argue that for electricity, local ownership of such networks is important for democracy. I assume that's also true of broadband as well. Um, so, what's your dream in terms of, say, what used to be called Twitter or X now, um, or about Google search platform?
Oh, I mean, we're going a little far afield from my technical expertise, but I do think that idea of essential infrastructure and especially the way that our economy has shifted to having our essential infrastructure be digital does mean that we should be thinking more about this. I mean, we always have this example of like the road network as sort of the like fundamental public investment where there's lots of private commerce that's competitive, right? Think about like package delivery, and you have the Postal Service and DHL and UPS and Amazon and whatever. Like everybody gets to use it in a non-discriminatory fashion, and it's a public investment that makes sure that it's possible to use all of those resources. And we used to do that with things like railroads to make sure that all communities across the country also have those opportunities. And I think some of the lessons from the deregulation of railroads are probably a warning for the dangers of leaving that essential infrastructure in private hands, which is that rates are no longer fair, but also lots of people lose service. Like kind of the core issue, both with airline and railroad deregulation, is that the industry then said there's a bunch of places we're not going to bother to serve anymore. And the problem is that it ends up hollowing out a lot of communities that then don't have access to that essential infrastructure. So I'm not technically savvy enough to understand exactly how those same things play out on social media or on search platforms. But I think it's a warning for us about leaving these in private hands when there's such essential infrastructure for our economy that people can manipulate them. And we're seeing that with X, of course, in the ways that Elon Musk has manipulated the algorithm to promote right wing or misinformation for the 2024 election. And so I do think that we need to be thinking about what are the right rules or right ownership structures for some of that essential infrastructure.
Yeah. Keep thinking about when I teach my regulated industries class, which it's been a while. Um, I keep thinking about the parallels between things like the internet, electricity, natural gas, airlines, and there's always some bottleneck that over which a monopoly holds. In the Google case, the DOJ is asking for divestiture of Chrome, potentially Android, and Google's holdings in AI ventures, to sort of break up that bottleneck, at least the incentive from the ability. And so I'm thinking that at the risk of upsetting people who are very big Section 230 defenders, um, there's some pretty strong parallels between electricity and the internet here. Do you think those will do the trick, and or not?
I mean, it makes intellectual sense to me that breaking up Google and breaking up utilities could have a similar benefit in reducing conflicts of interest in providing those core services. In the case of electricity, of delivery of electricity that's reliable and affordable and clean, or in the case of Google, the provision of information to consumers, to businesses, for everything from commerce to citizenship that we need. And we're definitely seeing. I mean, one of the things that I see from the Google, uh, the growth of its monopoly power has been the dumbing down of its search, that it is much more difficult sometimes to find good independent information through these search engines because Google, by being dominant and spending lots of money being dominant, like its investment in Apple to be the dominant search engine, means that everybody figures out how to game that system. I think about search engine optimization all the time when I search for something, and I'm like, I do that, like for travel blogs, for example. I like to travel, and I try to find information about like where I want to visit when I go to Italy, for example. And there's like 400 blogs that all seem the same, of like people who gave up their jobs, or they're like digital nomads or whatever, but they all name the same places that they go, and it's like all the posts are structured in the same way. And I think, David Roberts, who I listen to a lot of, he has the Volts podcast, but he also used to write for Vox, has borrowed from someone else's term, "enshittification" of the internet, that it has become, really difficult to find quality, independent, um, verifiable information in many cases. And I do think that breaking up the Google search from its AI functions, from its Chrome function, and having an opportunity for competition, which I see as one of the potential remedies the government is pursuing there around search, seems very interesting, because I think we do need some other opportunities. I mean, I'm old enough to remember that we had competing search engines back in the day. The Google was not the only game in town. It was just the best when it first came around, but I don't think it is anymore. But it's, that barrier to entry now at this point for anyone else to come in, I think is really difficult. I don't know. I hope any of that made
Yeah.
sense. Like I said, not my area of expertise, but I do think of the parallels a lot between that and electricity.
John, I would be remiss not to mention that Cory Doctorow, who was on a guest on our show, I'm pretty sure coined the term enshittification. And by the way,
Yeah.
you've now said two dirty words on this show. I hope we don't lose our broadcast license. But let me shift gears because I think we get the word bullshit out, which is just hard for me to even repeat. Without shuddering a bit. I want to shift gears to the election because we're all election experts, right? And we're watching a lot of Twitter and stuff. But I guess I have a base issue. Is anyone voting on these issues? Do you think any evidence that people care about energy and electricity when they go out and vote, or the parties? Does this ever become a political issue?
I mean, I think that people's individual financial circumstances drive how they vote. And to the degree to which electricity costs are part of that, that's what they're voting on. I don't think most people even understand, we run into this a lot when we are working with folks who are doing like public ownership campaigns of utilities. And what they find is that most people didn't know who owned the utility. Most people don't realize that there are monopolies out there. Or if they do, they don't understand the difference between it being a public or a private company. So I don't think people are voting on this. I think people who I'm particularly disappointed by people who argue that somehow there was like antitrust overreach under the Biden administration and that it was voters were reacting to that. I think it's ridiculous. I look at the things that were yeah, I mean, just the kinds of things that the Biden administration was doing, like, oh, make it easier for me to unsubscribe to a terrible service that I got signed up for. Like, who would oppose that? I mean, these are things that are very good for consumers, but you don't. That's not what people are. Most people are probably not even familiar with the fact that those things were happening, and they're certainly not making a voting decision on that basis. Other than a very few like nerd of us that spend our time on social media talking about antitrust, yeah, maybe we've wanted to vote on that basis, but most people are just thinking about their pocketbook and I think also like, do I like the incumbent? Is the incumbent responsible for how I'm feeling right now? And I think many people had a good answer for that.
I just want you to know that a very important person, in fact, the person who ran the antitrust division under Trump won, Macon Delrahim, disagrees with you. And he took to LinkedIn over the weekend, and I don't spend any time there, but I got a notification, so I stupidly followed it. And he said, he proclaimed that voters have rejected the quote regulatory overreach of the Biden administration. That was his reading of the election results anyway. And so he thinks that voters were actually asking to pull back on antitrust enforcement. Seems like you're not convinced of that one.
I just find the whole notion of people claiming mandates and, overwhelming opinions about particular things. I think voters basically said, we're not at feeling as well off as we did 4 years ago, and Biden is currently president, and we're going to vote for the person who is on the other ticket. And in the end, we're talking about a margin in the popular vote of a couple million out of like 150 million or something like that. I mean, it's extraordinarily the narrowness of this decision. So I don't think there's a mandate for anything, honestly. It's sometimes surprising how widely different the policy choices are going to be between a Biden administration and a Trump administration, given how narrow that victory was. But I think most people, there's some good evidence essentially that, yeah, inflation cooled down in terms of the rate of increase, but the impacts that it had and the expiration of the pandemic era relief programs that impacted a lot of people, everything from child tax credits to the eviction ban to Medicaid expansion, things that have real pocketbook and livelihood impacts on people, made a big difference. People actually care that whether or not their personal financial situation is better now than it was 4 years ago. And I don't think any discussion about Lena Khan and what the FTC was doing in antitrust efforts could have made a difference when people were feeling like, what, take home $1,000 less a month.
Now, let me apply for my job at the Chamber of Commerce right now, and respond to a tweet in which you are pushing back on the notion that regulation stifles innovation. Do you remember that tweet that you made? Um, the basic.
I don't know if I do, but I'm fascinated to make this argument whether I remember it or not.
Okay. Well, so what's basically happening, and this is me doing my Chamber of Commerce impression, is well, see what you're doing is you're engaging in this anti-American, anti-competitive communist strategy to force and to try to let people cancel their gym memberships and cancel all these other subscriptions, and you're adding all these regulations that are confusing. And also that hamper the ability of companies to innovate. And so if you just let America be America again, and remove all these regulations, then companies such as electric utilities would be able to innovate our way out of many of our problems, including things like climate change.
Um, I love that notion, and it's a great campaign slogan, and you should stick with it. But I also think it's hilarious. Um, yeah, I think about uh, shoot, I lost my train of thought there.
Yes, the abundance. Isn't
Oh,
that part of the abundance agenda, John? I was thinking, like, right, we
oh,
just get out of the way, and these guys are going to
I,
innovate our way to all solutions. Sorry, go ahead. I interrupted.
Get out of the
no,
way, and there'll be more for, and we don't care about distribution. There just has to be more.
but I think one of the things that to me is I think a really well-researched warning about that concept that removing regulation results in innovation and better outcomes. It was a study by the Citizens Utility Board of Illinois about retail competition in the electricity sector. So they had deregulated retail sales, which you're familiar with in Texas. And people like me in Minnesota are like, wow, the idea I could have a choice is crazy. But I still remember one line from the report, which essentially said that what we brought to electricity pricing was the cable subscription model of like promotional pricing and confusing idea, like a lot of confusion essentially about how much you were actually going to be paying, masked behind this idea of competition. So the ultimate choices for the consumer, it was really difficult as a consumer to even figure out what was the thing that was going to be to my benefit, because with the promotional pricing and the time frames and whatever, you might not really understand what was going to be in your best interest. As a result, what the Citizens Utility Board concluded was retail competition was on net not worth it, that it was not bringing lower prices to consumers, which makes some sense, honestly, because if you're all buying from the same suppliers, how are you really going to provide any significant benefits to consumers? I mean, and ultimately as well, like the savings to be had in structuring rates for consumers is in whether or not you can avoid some of those capital investments that need to be made, for example. So for me to get a little wonky in the electricity sector for a second, I just don't think there's a lot of evidence that that actually works. On the other hand, there's a lot of evidence that mandates of utilities to try things like with renewable energy in the electricity sector is what has in fact sparked innovation in different technologies, in different ways that we can do electricity. Like we wouldn't have solar and wind competitive with fossil fuel electricity technology if it weren't for states like Iowa or Minnesota that in the 1990s told utilities, you shall make this investment. And if it continues to be cost effective, you'll make more investment. And it was. And it was that really sort of rebirthed the commercial renewable energy, renewable electricity market. And so I don't find it very credible that regulation is a problem. I don't think that it's not a universal. I think you can absolutely impose regulations in ways that are problematic. I just read an article the other day about how the legislature in Minnesota tried to create a licensing procedure for copper resales to try to avoid problems with people stealing copper out of you know street lights, for example, in the state. And the folks who do scrap metal recycling were like, "You're going to destroy the entire industry." So I think we can overreach, but I don't see a lot of evidence that what was happening at the FTC in the last 4 years was doing that.
Well, I think that's a good place for us to wrap up. John, it was a real pleasure to have you on the show. And I think I learned a lot on this. And I hope our listeners are going to learn a lot about the utility industry and the nexus between the utility and the anti-monopoly concerns of the new Brandeisian crowd. Thanks so much for coming on, and enjoyed having you.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. It was a pleasure. Great conversation. I definitely hope to be more engaged with folks in the anti-monopoly work to better understand the lessons that I can learn for the work in the utility sector.
Great.